The year was 1457. An Ottoman army of 80,000 soldiers marched into Albania, carrying absolute confidence. They brought siege towers, war elephants, and the very cannons that had shattered the walls of Constantinople. For 3 months straight, they found absolutely nothing. No fortresses to besiege, no armies waiting in formation, no visible resistance of any kind, just empty villages, burned fields, and a silence so heavy it felt like a deliberate message. The Ottomans were chasing an enemy that simply refused to show itself. Supplies started running low. Disease crept through the camps. Soldiers disappeared into the night without a word. What had begun as a confident conquest slowly transformed into something nobody had planned for, a quiet unraveling inside a land that seemed to digest armies without a trace. Then on September 2nd, when Ottoman commanders had finally convinced themselves the threat was gone, the mountains woke up. What followed wasn't just a military defeat. It was the kind of humiliation that empires spend centuries trying to bury and forget. This is the story of how a single man, armed with nothing but patience and a deep understanding of his enemy's psychology, turned the most powerful military force on the planet into a masterclass in how not to fight a war. But before we get into any of that, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps more than most people realize, and there's a lot more content like this coming your way. Now, this story doesn't start on a battlefield. It starts with a child. 20 years before that devastating ambush, a boy of around 8 years old walked through the gates of the Ottoman imperial court. His name was Gergely Kastriotiti, son of an Albanian nobleman. He hadn't been kidnapped in the traditional sense. He had been traded. The Ottoman system known as devshirme operated with a cold, almost mechanical efficiency. Officials would identify sons of conquered nobility, present their fathers with a choice that wasn't really a choice, and absorb those children into the empire's military machine. The logic behind it was genuinely clever. Take your enemy's heirs and turn them into your most loyal commanders. For decades, it worked without a single problem. For 20 years, it worked perfectly on Gergely too. He was placed in elite palace schools where the empire groomed its future military leadership. He studied cavalry, tactics, siege warfare, military engineering, and logistics. He became fluent in Ottoman, Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. He converted to Islam and received a new name. But beyond all of that, he absorbed something far more valuable. He learned exactly how the Ottoman Empire thought. He understood that their entire military doctrine was built around one core principle: mass and shock. Bring a force so overwhelming that resistance feels completely irrational. Move fast enough that enemies fall into panic before they can coordinate. Create the psychological impression that fighting back is pointless. Then watch most conflicts resolve themselves before serious combat even begins. The system worked because every opponent the Ottomans faced believed in it. By his mid-30s, now going by Skanderbeg, meaning Lord Alexander, he was commanding Ottoman armies on active campaigns. He had a strong reputation inside the empire's inner circles. His discipline and tactical precision were spoken of with genuine respect. And then, in November 1443, during a messy engagement against Hungarian forces, Skanderbeg and around 300 Albanian cavalry under his command simply walked away from the Ottoman line. No speech, no declaration, no dramatic moment. They were there, and then they weren't. The empire had spent 2 full decades sharpening a weapon, feeding it every detail of their internal systems, their patterns, their assumptions about loyalty. And now that weapon was walking out the door, carrying all of it with him. What the Ottomans would take years to understand was that Skanderbeg had never actually become what they thought they had created. He had hidden his real identity behind flawless obedience, waiting for the single moment when obedience would no longer serve his actual purpose. The Devshirme system had a blind spot built into its foundation. It assumed that loyalty could be engineered through education and reward. It assumed that a boy removed from his homeland would eventually forget where he came from. Skanderbeg never forgot. He just made sure nobody could see that he remembered. And in doing so, the Ottomans had handed their future enemy something extraordinary. 2 decades of unrestricted access to their war rooms, their strategic debates, their internal weaknesses, and their decision-making structures. He knew how Ottoman generals thought because he had been one. He knew what moves they would make in any given situation because he had made those same moves himself. What happened next is one of the most underrated moments in military history. Skanderbeg didn't attack the Ottoman fortress of Kruj. He walked through the front gate carrying a forged letter. Using his deep familiarity with Ottoman administrative systems, he produced a document that appeared to come directly from Sultan Murad II, ordering the fortress governor to hand over control immediately. The forgery was precise enough, the correct phrasing, the correct seal format, that the governor obeyed without question, without a single casualty, without any siege equipment. Skanderbeg walked away with Albania's most strategically critical fortress. The Ottomans didn't lose it. Programmed as their walls failed. They lost it because someone understood their bureaucracy better than the people running it. When Sultan Murad II found out, the response was immediate. An army estimated between 25,000 and 40,000 soldiers marched toward Kruj, expecting to crush a minor revolt within days. Skanderbeg had roughly 8,000 fighters. Standard military thinking said this was over before it started. Instead, Skanderbeg did something the Ottoman commanders never anticipated. He used their own tactics against them. He positioned his force in terrain where heavy cavalry couldn't move freely. Grayly staged a false retreat that looked exactly like a breaking Albanian line, and watched as Ottoman horsemen charged forward and separated themselves from their own infantry. His forces hit from concealed positions in the hills, and the result was devastating. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers killed, the rest retreating in chaos. But the deeper damage wasn't the body count. It was the realization that Ottoman tactics were readable, that their dependence on overwhelming force created patterns, and patterns once recognized could be broken. For the next 13 years, what followed barely resembled conventional warfare. Ottoman armies of 30,000, 50,000, even 70,000 soldiers would march into Albania, set up for engagement, and Skanderbeg would simply dissolve. His forces would break into small mobile units, hit supply lines, ambush isolated patrols, and disappear before any response could reach them. The Ottomans would control ground during daylight hours and lose it again by nightfall. There was no front line to hold, no army to locate and pin down, nothing for the empire's massive military power to grip. This was not guerrilla warfare born from weakness. It was guerrilla warfare as a deliberate, studied strategy. And it was making the most powerful empire on earth look completely helpless. Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had taken Constantinople, who had ended the Byzantine Empire, who was being called the conqueror across 3 continents, took this personally. In 1457, he assembled over 80,000 soldiers, experienced commanders, his own nephew leading cavalry, and even Skanderbeg's nephew Hamza Kastrioti, who had defected to the Ottomans and was now positioned to help destroy his uncle's resistance from the inside. This was not a military campaign. It was a statement. The army entered Albania in late spring. For months, they found exactly what every previous invasion had found: emptiness. Villages cleared before they arrived. Fields burned, wells poisoned, no supplies to seize, no population to intimidate, no enemy to engage. The army was enormous and completely paralyzed by it. Disease spread, hunger set in. The psychological pressure of marching through a landscape that offered nothing and resisted everything began to crack the command structure. Desertions increased. Commanders argued. Morale collapsed quietly, without a single battle being lost. And Skanderbeg waited. The Ottoman system was built entirely on momentum. Enter a region with overwhelming force, win a decisive engagement, establish a garrison, move to the next objective. The speed and scale of conquest was itself a psychological tool. It made resistance feel irrational before it even began. But in Albania, there was nothing to conquer in that way. No armies to destroy, no capital to occupy, no king to capture or negotiate with, just mountains that absorbed soldiers and gave nothing back. Every additional day the Ottomans remained without a decisive outcome was a day their army grew weaker, their supplies thinner, and their commanders more desperate for an ending that made sense. Skanderbeg didn't need battlefield victories. He just needed to make sure the Ottomans couldn't have any either. And in that sustained denial, in that patient refusal to give the empire the kind of fight it had been built to win, he was destroying something far more valuable than land. He was destroying confidence. By late August 1457, Ottoman commanders reached a conclusion. The rebellion had collapsed. Skanderbeg's forces hadn't been seen in weeks. No raids, no ambushes, nothing. The most logical explanation was that the Albanians had finally broken and scattered. The Ottoman army set up camp on a wide open plain near Ujebada. Flat terrain, good visibility, defensible position. Everything a massive resting army could want. For the first time in months, they allowed themselves to relax. That was the last mistake they made. September 2nd, 1457, just before dawn, Skanderbeg's forces, which had never disbanded and had only been hidden, launched a coordinated assault from the surrounding high ground. Multiple strike points, simultaneous attacks, fighters appearing from directions that should have been empty. The Ottomans were not in combat readiness. Many were still asleep. Weapons weren't distributed. The command structure couldn't respond fast enough to mean anything. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. Albanian cavalry tore through the flanks. Infantry collapsed under pressure from fighters who had spent months preparing for this single moment. Hamza Kastriati, Skanderbeg's defector nephew, the man brought in to deliver Ottoman victory, was captured alive. He wasn't executed. He was imprisoned and publicly humiliated, sent back as a message about what betrayal costs. By the time the sun went down, the invasion force was shattered. Estimates suggest between 15,000 and 30,000 Ottoman soldiers killed or captured. The survivors fled without coordination. Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, had just suffered one of the most damaging defeats of his entire reign. And it wasn't because he was outfought in any conventional sense. It was because he had been outthought. The trap worked because Skanderbeg understood exactly how armies process frustration. After months of chasing nothing, losing men to disease rather than combat, commanders needed a narrative that let them go home without calling it failure. So Skanderbeg gave them that narrative. He vanished completely, stopped every visible operation, pulled back every unit, and let the Ottomans arrive at the conclusion they desperately wanted to reach. Then, once that belief had hardened into certainty, once the army had shifted from combat readiness into the administrative mindset of wrapping up a campaign, he activated everything. This was not opportunism. This was months of psychological engineering. He had trained his fighters not to act even when targets presented themselves, because he understood that no individual ambush was worth disrupting the larger operation. The real prize was not any single patrol. It was the moment when an 80,000-man army stopped looking for him. That transition from active threat assessment to relaxed assumption was the window he had spent the entire summer building toward. And when it opened, he walked through it with everything he had. The attack's coordination alone said something significant. Multiple units striking simultaneously from different directions meant Skanderbeg had maintained complete command over a force the Ottomans believed was disbanded and demoralized. His fighters had been positioned, supplied, and briefed without triggering a single report from Ottoman scouts. The mountains had looked empty because his people knew how to disappear inside them. The casualties at Ujebadha were serious, but the damage that actually mattered was reputational. Mehmed II had taken Constantinople. He had buried the Byzantine Empire. He had brought on Crusader armies, and now he had been humiliated by a conflict in a mountainous corner of the Balkans that was never supposed to last more than a season. The empire's enemies across Europe noticed. Kingdoms that had spent decades fearing Ottoman expansion suddenly saw something they hadn't seen in a long time. A visible crack. Skanderbeg became a symbol not because of any single victory, but because he had demonstrated something that nobody had managed to show before. That the Ottoman military machine could be exhausted, frustrated, and embarrassed by an opponent who simply refused to fight on their terms. That the empire's size could be engineered into a weakness. That patience and terrain understanding could completely neutralize numerical advantage. After Ujebada, the Ottomans didn't just want to defeat Skanderbeg militarily. They needed to erase what he represented. Mehmed personally led further invasions. He brought the same siege artillery that had dismantled Constantinople's walls to Cruje. Prolonged bombardments, extended sieges, attempts to starve the Albanians into surrender. None of it worked cleanly. Even when the Ottomans held territory, they couldn't hold it securely. Supply convoys were raided. Garrisons were hit and hit again. Every territorial gain required resources so disproportionate to the outcome that the entire enterprise became unsustainable. The empire was burning money, soldiers, and political credibility on a conflict in a region that refused to resolve. And the reason it refused to resolve wasn't Albanian military strength. It was Albanian strategic patience. Skanderbeg never tried to take Ottoman cities. He never attempted to hold large territories. He built no empire of his own. He simply made sure the Ottomans could not build theirs inside Albania, and he did that for 25 years. When he died in 1468 from illness, the Ottomans finally absorbed Albania. But the cost was a generation of campaigns, thousands of soldiers, and decades of commanders who had to learn firsthand that overwhelming force accomplishes nothing when your enemy refuses to let you use it properly. The question that lingered inside Ottoman strategic thinking long after Skanderbeg was gone wasn't about tactics or territory. It was something more foundational. How do you defeat an enemy who won't give you the kind of fight your entire system was built to win? Their military doctrine had been developed and refined against enemies who believed in Ottoman invincibility and therefore behaved predictably. Field engagements where numbers mattered, sieges where artillery could solve the problem, campaigns where speed and shock produced capitulation before organized resistance could form. All of it became irrelevant against someone who understood the doctrine completely and simply declined to participate in it. Skanderbeg's war didn't fit any category the empire had a prepared response for. It wasn't a siege because there was no fixed defense to break. It wasn't a field engagement because there was no army to locate and destroy. It wasn't a political rebellion because there was no leadership structure to negotiate with or remove. It was something the Ottomans had no name for. A sustained, disciplined refusal. a conflict defined entirely by what Skanderbeg would not allow them to do. That inversion of initiative, that constant denial of the decisive confrontation the empire required, was more damaging psychologically than any battlefield defeat could have been, because it revealed a structural gap in a system built on the assumption that sufficient force could solve any problem. It couldn't force someone to fight. It could only create conditions where fighting appeared to be the rational choice. And if the person on the other side was willing to absorb those conditions, willing to sacrifice short-term opportunity for long-term resistance, the empire's leverage dissolved entirely. Skanderbeg proved that Ottoman invincibility was a performance, one that required the enemy's participation to function. If you didn't believe in it, if you understood that the empire's strength depended on opponents accepting certain assumptions about what was and wasn't possible, then you could simply opt out. And in opting out, you could convert their greatest structural advantages into structural liabilities. Large armies needing massive supply chains. Reliance on speed making sustained stalemates intolerable. Need for decisive outcomes making ambiguous results feel like failures. Every feature of the Ottoman system that had been a strength against conventional opponents became a pressure point against someone who understood the system from the inside and had spent decades thinking about where it could be broken. The Ottomans never solved him. They simply waited for him to die. And even then, what he had demonstrated didn't disappear with him. It stayed as a question the empire could never fully answer. About what happens when the enemy refuses to be the enemy you were built to defeat.